Ampeg has been an established name for bass players for over 70 years, and is a signature tone used on hundreds if not thousands of records. Today we're going to be looking at their two entry-level offerings that are both affordable and portable, Micro SVT and the Portaflex 350. These two amplifiers have been offered by Ampeg for quite a while and are the same price. But do they sound the same? Let's find out. As always, I will put the time up here so you can skip all my talking and just go straight to the sound samples if that's what you wish. But for everyone else, let me give you a quick rundown of why I'm doing this and how I'm doing this. So I've always loved the sound of Ampegs. I think they're super universal. You can use them for so many different genres, and they have such a very specific tone to them that when I hear it, I can tell, oh, they're playing through an Ampeg. Just like I can with a guitar amp, oh, they're playing through a classic Fender amp, or they're playing through a modded Marshall Plexi. Like, they have those sounds to them. And I also started playing bass for a band recently, so I wanted to have something more small and portable, because that's the other big issue with bass amps, is they're huge and heavy and just a pain to carry around. So I was looking for an Ampeg sound in a small package. As many of you know, tube amps aren't as popular in the bass world. But we are going to be looking at two different types of power. One, the SVT Micro is fully solid state FET, and the Portaflex is Class D, which is a newer technology that is lighter and allows you to have more power with a smaller package, right? They're about the same weight. They're kind of equally as portable. I know the Portaflex seems like it would be a little bit more portable, but it seems like the same weight, and it's really not much of a size difference. So if that's your determining factor, I wouldn't worry about that. Now, both of these amps have the same exact controls. They both have bass, middle, treble, gain, volume, and a 15 dB pad and a limiter. So exact same front panel. Really the only difference, as far as I'm aware, is the power section, Class D versus the solid state power section, which puts out a different wattage, right? So Portaflex puts out 350 watts at 4 ohms or 250 at 8 ohms. And the SVT puts out 200 watts at 4 ohms or 150 watts at 8 ohms. Now, guitarists out there might be saying, oh, that's a massive difference, but really in the bass world, as a lot of you probably know, that's not a huge difference, because bass amps require way more wattage, and since these are solid state, you're going to want as much headroom as possible, because you don't want to push the amp too hard. Versus tubes, we purposely push those amps hard to create overdrive, because those tubes being pushed is pleasing to our ears. So there's a bigger threshold of volume that we can get from a 15 watt tube guitar amp, right? So that was a huge factor between these two, and I wanted to decide. I initially bought the Portaflex because I thought I needed as much wattage as possible, but I also wanted to have two cabinets, and I happened to find a used SVT with the cabinet too, so I ended up with two of these, and I will be picking one and getting rid of the other. But that also leads me to the cabinet that comes with the SVT is an 8 ohms, so you're only going to be running at 150 watts through one cabinet. Now in this test, I'm running through two cabinets in parallel, so both of them are going to be running at their full power usage at 4 ohms, so 350 watts and 200 watts, just to make it as fair as possible. One of my concerns was, since at 8 ohms the Portaflex runs at 250 watts and the cabinet is rated at 200, so that was a little concerning to me if, you know, it blowing the speaker, right? So I wanted to run it at 4 ohms because the Portaflex is 350 watts at 4 ohms. At both cabinets, you combine both those wattages, that's 400 watts. So that's a safe way to run it. I have run it, the Portaflex, through a single cab and haven't had any issues. And you can kind of tell if you're pushing the speaker too hard. So it's not that concerning. I would still be comfortable enough running the Portaflex through one cab if I had to, but it's something to keep in mind. So for this setup here, I'm running technically four microphones on this setup here. SM57 on the lower cab, center cone, and a large diaphragm condenser. I chose that because I wanted a flatter microphone tube to pick up some of the lower frequencies that an SM57 would kind of shelve off. So that's why I combined those two microphones. And then I have like a stereo room mic very slightly underneath, just to kind of give you a feel of the room and to kind of perceive the loudness. That's another thing to mention. Since I wanted to kind of test the volume, I did not do any volume matching at all throughout this video, which I usually do because when something is louder, you usually perceive it to be better. So I normally like to volume match, but in this case, I really wanted to kind of just leave it uncompressed, unchanged, and just have you hear the difference in volume as well. I'll talk more about volume after we hear sound samples, but other things to mention about the setup here is I'm running two performances through a looper. It's identical, literally as close as you could possibly get, and you'll be able to hear that. It's crazy similar. But I guess I shouldn't say anything else until you hear it yourself, so let's go ahead and listen to it, and then I'll give you my thoughts. So as you probably heard, they're pretty close. Put the settings up there. I left everything at noon on the first one, which in my opinion is an ideal setup for a lot of amps, but especially these amps. I felt like that is the absolute sweet spot for these amps. Everything at noon, gain, bass, middle, treble, and volume at noon. The amp just feels like that's where it wants to be. And then you could just make minor adjustments from there. The second sample you heard was every EQ at noon, which the EQ is at noon this entire time because I think that's just the ideal spot. It cuts through the best without being muddy or over bassy. There's not too much treble. It's just where it should be. But then the second setting that you heard is what I normally run the amp when I'm playing with my band. EQ at noon, gain at 1, and volume at 1. There's just a little bit of a volume hump when you pass noon. It gives me a little bit more volume. The gain can be adjusted depending on your bass, which I forgot to mention I'm using a Danelectro bass with single coil lipstick pickups, which I love the sound of that bass for sure. I like to leave the gain right where it's just touching the peak meter, and then I'll just back off slightly because I think that's the ideal setting, is just turn the gain up just enough where it's peaking, then bring it back tight a slight bit, and then EQ at noon, and then volume at wherever. Ideally as close to noon as possible, but obviously if you need a little bit more volume, you're going to have to turn it up a little bit more. So that brings to the other thing. One thing that I heard that was a big difference between the two was after passing 1 o'clock on the volume knob, which you could hear on the last two samples there, which there was a 3 o'clock and then full volume. The SVT just, after 1 o'clock, it doesn't get any louder and it just sounds worse in my opinion. Now the Portaflex, you can hear, that's when the only difference really came, was once you hit 3 o'clock, there was still some more volume, and that's pretty much the main difference between these two in my opinion. I mean, they sound insanely similar, and I believe people have even mentioned that they really are the same circuit besides the different power section, which I mentioned earlier. Surprises me though that Ampeg has sold both of these for so long. They seem so interchangeable. It almost seems weird to me that a company would release two products that are just so similar. One last thing about the volume is I've used both of these amps in a rehearsal and live setting, and on the recording, I can definitely hear a difference in volume, no question. But in a live scenario, I don't really notice much of a volume difference. If you really like the SVT sound, but you were worried that you needed those extra 100 watts from the Portaflex, I would say it's not going to be that much of a difference, and I would go with the SVT. If you were like really in a super loud band, like maybe like a heavy metal band with multiple guitarists using half stacks and that kind of shit, well, yeah, this isn't going to hold up. To get a bigger cabinet, I think would help more, because that's another thing I noticed. I felt like the cabinet was starting to give out, and you can kind of hear some flub as the volume got really loud, because I think the SVT pushes the cabinet as hard as it can really go anyways. So having the extra 100 watts is more just for clean headroom. I know that that's mentioned a lot, and that might be important to some people, but I think either of these will get you similar results in a live setting. So it's really, I couldn't hear much of a difference, and I'm pretty picky with tone. So if you could hear a difference and you prefer one or the other, I would just go with that one based on, I would pick it over sound and not wattage, because I was focused on wattage, and now after hearing these and owning both of them, I feel like it was silly to worry about the wattage that much. It doesn't make a huge difference in this specific scenario. I got another sound sample for you. Here's me going through all the settings so that you can hear them. If you don't want to hear me going through every single knob, I'll put the time to skip here because there's one other section that you might be interested in. But for you true nerds out there, here is me adjusting every single setting so you can hear the range of EQ and volume comparatively. All right, one last section. I hope that was useful. I don't have a ton of notes on those, but hopefully comparing those settings will help you decide which one is for you. But there's one last thing to go through here, and that is the direct sound. I've seen some complaints of the direct DI out of the SVT sounding bad, and that's why they went with the Portaflex. Vice versa. I've also heard one other complaint I've heard is the fan in the SVT. And I never understood why that was such a big complaint until I pushed the amp really hard and then the fan turned on extra hard and I could hear how loud it really was. That's still not a issue for me, because if I'm pushing the amp that hard, I'm in such a loud environment that I don't care that a fan having a lot of noise. In a studio environment, I wouldn't be pushing the amp that hard anyways, especially a solid state amp. So the Portaflexes definitely have a quieter fan. So I'm not going to argue that, but it doesn't make a difference to me. So that's just my personal opinion, but that's something to consider too. But this last section is the DI. I ran the same performance, and additionally, just for the heck of it, I have a analog amp sim pedal that's supposed to model a Ampeg SVT. So why not compare it against these two? So the first you're going to hear is the pure clean DI going direct into the interface. Then you're going to hear my amp sim pedal going direct in. Then you're going to hear the DI out of the SVT and Portaflex, and you will be able to compare all of those sounds and see what the DI adds to your direct sound. One thing to note is on the amps, the EQ and the gain do affect the DI sound, but not the volume. But for this, I left everything at noon just to keep it consistent and comparable. So let's go ahead and hear that. All right, so after hearing that, I would say the Ampegs definitely provide a nice DI. I don't have any complaints on that at all. I think it would be a big improvement over just using a direct sound to a soundboard at a live event, or if you were in the recording studio and you couldn't mic up an amp, or you wanted to combine it with a mic'd sound. I think those are both fantastic sounding DIs. The SVT and the Portaflex, again, sounded identical to me. It sounded the exact same, so I would assume they have the same DI in their circuitry. Now the Simplifier clone that I have, so that's not an actual Simplifier, but it's a cheaper knockoff of the Simplifier Bass Station. That, I think, sounded great too. I'm not sure which one I would prefer to use. I have been using that Simplifier clone for the album that I'm currently playing bass on. There's more flexibility with the Simplifier because you have more options, and I think the gain that you get from that, which I didn't really demonstrate because I wanted to keep it consistent, but you could get more gain. The overdrive sound you would get from these amps isn't sufficient in my opinion. If you're playing like harder music like I am, I'm playing punk rock stuff, so I need a little bit more overdrive than that's able to offer. So that's another thing to keep in mind. But other than that, I don't really know. This one was even closer than I could have possibly imagined. So I'm still kind of on the fence. I would really like to hear what you guys think, because hey, maybe that will help me decide. One last thing I would like to mention is the Portaflex did cut out and the fault light went on. I'm curious if anyone else has a Portaflex out there, if that's happened to them. Is that something to be concerned about? I noticed this has happened multiple times, so I'm not sure if that's just like a safety feature to make sure that it doesn't get damaged because it's being pushed too hard, but why would it not be able to be turned up? Why would they even give you the option to have that volume if it's going to overheat the amp, right? So that's super weird to me. If anyone knows any more information about that, please leave it in the comments. It'd be super helpful. But other than that, I hope this was also useful for you guys. If you're into amp comparisons and pedal reviews, cover songs, anything music production wise, I want to do some more stuff on studio techniques and miking techniques in the future. So if any of that sounds appealing to you, please subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next one.